All right, so real quickly, you guys have your lab practical this week. Don't forget to write your cheat sheet front and back, 8.5 by 11. You guys can do pen, pencil, crayon, whatever. It's just crayon is not really thin and you can't write real sharp and tiny with crayon. So you can do pictures, write them out. You can't cut and paste anything on there, but you can draw pictures. You can label things. You can take that exam seriously. That is not an exam that gets dropped and replaced by exam 6. That is a standalone exam, okay? So make sure you guys are ready for that sucker. It reviews everything in lab, histology, bones, everything. The other thing I would say is if you guys go on the A&P website, under lab news in week 15, it has a link to the 227 lab practical study guide. So you can click on that and it'll give you some reminders and tips to look at. I highly suggest you guys look at it. It was not updated yet for this semester, so even though it says on there cat photos, no, there are not going to be any cat photos on the lab practical because you guys did not do cat dissection, okay? But you can see cadaver pictures, anatomized pictures, models, bones, histology, all of that stuff will be on there, okay? You'll have questions about Phil's assignments. And what are Phil's? They're physiology questions. Where'd you guys learn physiology? Lecture. Okay, lab and lecture really do go hand in hand, even though you guys don't always want to believe it. It does. Okay, ideally, if you did some good conclusions for your Phils, you should just be able to pull those up, read through that. Do not waste time putting a bunch of data tables and data information in your cheat sheet because it is not data driven. It's about the concept. Understand the Phil's concept from those exercises and you should be able to answer those questions. It's okay if you need to put, like a little sentence or a statement that reminds you what you did in that experiment because that helped you remember what happens if this happens, then this happens. If there's high concentration here, where does water flow? A picture is worth 1,000 words. You can draw pictures or diagrams on there and they can help you a lot. As far as another thing I wanted to mention, because you guys did not have dissection in so much, you had a little dissection in 227, you guys may not be familiar with a couple of terms. The word, so when we do dissection, it meant that you guys would have been cleaning things up and so that you could view things. So you might have to get fat and CT out of the way so you could have seen the muscle. The other term would be transection. Transection would mean that you have cut through, in the majority of what you guys would do in 227 is you would have been transecting potential muscles so you could see the deeper muscles. So I'm going to write that word on here, which can also be used for me reviewing the regeneration of nerve tissue in a minute. So a transection, that's an N, equals a cut, essentially. And usually we would transect a muscle in the belly of the muscle, right in the center of it, okay? Not at a tendon, typically. The next word would be reflection. This pen is kind of writing a little funny, guys, sorry. This is really weird. I think when they tried to fix it, they did some weird stuff. Reflection. That basically means if I had, so like our muscle on the side there, let's say we had our muscle here, okay, and I transected it like scissors, I cut it in the middle of the muscle, and then if I folded this piece of tissue back on itself, so flipped it out so I could see what was underneath, that's what reflection is. Okay, so it's folding it back so you can see the deeper structures. So dissection is cleaning things up so you could see from kind of origin to insertion of the muscle, essentially. Then a transection would be to cut the muscle. Typically, it would be done in the belly of the muscle. You could transect at a tendon, but typically we do not. And then reflection would be to take those flaps, the two bellies of that muscle now that you've artificially created, and flip them out so you could see underneath. And I wanted to mention that because it may say things like on the cadaver pictures on the lab practical, where it may say that, what is the transected muscle? And I'm looking at the eval going, they don't know what transection is because they didn't get to dissect much. You guys did transect the sheep brain. Okay, you guys made a sagittal cut and a coronal cut, right? That was a transection of the brain that you guys created. You guys just didn't have to reflect anything because you weren't flipping things backwards to see things deeper. So I wanted to mention that. Tell your friends. I'll try to remember to put that on a board or something for those that may not get to hear this lecture before Thursday or Friday. I think that covers everything about the lab practical. Don't forget to do a cheat sheet. You guys are going to do awesome. As soon as the lab practical is done, you guys get to leave. So you'll be out of lab early, and there's no more lab after you've done that. So after that, you can focus on exam 5, exam 6, other finals, that kind of thing. Yay! All right, so any other questions about the lab practical real quick? You guys did really good, by the way, on the muscle evals. Awesome job. You guys may not know the difference unless any of you had taken the class before or possibly taken it at another institution. But our hope was that even though you guys didn't have the experience of dissecting, you guys get plenty of dissection still in 228, even without cats. But our hope was that you guys would, instead of stressing out about trying to find the structures you're looking for and dissecting, and then you guys would get on your eval and you didn't know any of your muscles. Some did, obviously, but some people spent all that time dissecting and couldn't name a single muscle, even something easy like pectoralis major. And we're like, name something, anything that correlates. The cats have a lot of muscles that are named for the exact same thing as us. Just name anything. So our hope, and it seems like when we did the 2 different ways that we did the muscle eval this semester, that a lot of you guys were retaining and understanding the names of the muscles better and the location of them better than evals that we had that had to do with the cat. So I think that's a win-win, even though you guys might have been a little stressed over the whole situation, but you guys did great. All right, so I told you at the last lecture I'd come back to regeneration of nerve tissue because we were kind of running out of a little bit of time there, and I wanted to at least get the info out, and then we're going to come back and talk about it here for a second. So let me pull this up also. So basically, if we had a transection of a nerve, okay, so we had some sort of injury, the nerve gets cut. You guys know that myelin sheath around the nerve, what is it really made out of? It's Schwann cells or neuroleukocytes, and what is that made out of? What's the myelin itself? It's the cell wrapped around it, but what is it? Literally all it is phospholipids, multiple phospholipid bilayers wrapped and wrapped and wrapped and wrapped as a CT wrapper, right? Okay, so if you took butter and you sliced a knife through it, what do you think happens to that phospholipid layer? Like. They're not really attached by covalent bonds or anything, right? So what can they do? Suck back together, right? So the myelin, the endoneurium, if you will, has the ability to keep itself together, the CT wrapper there, okay? But, so we said here, I'm going to erase my original arrows on here for a second. But when it got cut, some trauma happened, and it got cut right through there. What happens is this seals up right away where that cut was. That's the first thing that happens. Then there's some swelling in there. And once you've severed the nerve, what happens to the distal part of the nerve? It dies. Why do you think it dies? No nutrients getting to it. It has no DNA because it's not connected to the cell body anymore. This is the axon. Okay, so now that it's not connected, it has no DNA information to tell it how to make proteins. That goes back to gene expression that we talked about before. So transcription, translation, you don't make any proteins. You don't have a protein to help repair anything. So this part of the nerve dies. And then you'll chew it up and, eat up the debris, get rid of it. And then because you have this root here, right, the nerve can regenerate. It's just very slow. How fast did we say that it grows per day? 1.5 millimeters per day. That's pretty slow. So macrophages are in there. They're eating up. I'm going to erase my X's. They're eating up the debris in here. Okay. We call that, when that distal part of the axon dies, that's called Wallerian degeneration. That's that weird W word, Wallerian degeneration. So that's the nerve died. So the Schwann cells, okay, or neurolemmacytes, they are the ones that form the regrowth tunnel, okay, which is what allows that axon sprout to find itself. So regeneration tube or regrowth tunnel is what will guide the slowly growing axon sprout back to the original site. And we said, remember, the further away or the more distal that injury was, the easier or more likely it was to be able to repair it. Versus if I cut myself, near the tip of my finger, I'm more likely to regenerate because that regrowth tunnel there doesn't have to go very far to get back to the effector or muscle or receptor or whatever else it had been going towards, correct? Wherever that nerve axon would have ended. But if I cut myself, say up here on my brachium, up near my deltoid muscle, let's say I chopped off my arm up there or got a deep cut there, how far does this tunnel have to go and how far does this nerve have to grow? It has so much further of a distance to go that it's possible that some of the nerve root might sneak out and go to other places and not ever make it down and get to the distal part that it needed to re-innervate, right? Get the nerve signal back out there. So that's why the further away it is from the cell body, the more likely it can regenerate and fix itself. It doesn't mean 100% it's going to happen, but you have a much better chance of healing if that does occur. So that's what it's showing you here. It's saying that the neurolemma and endoneurium form a regeneration tube. So that's this guy right here. And then it says on number 4, axon regenerates and remyelination occurs. So you have to rewrap this brand new baby axon that's growing, this rootlet that's coming out, right? You got to cover it again. And so that's why it's showing you new myelin sheaths being formed. Look, they still have nodes of Ranvier, so they don't touch. It works the exact same way as before. So we regrow that. And then at the end, if it finally makes it to that effector, whatever it was, in this case, the skeletal muscle, it makes its neuromuscular junctions again, and everybody is happy. You have innervation, you can move your muscle again, and that is essentially what we learned about there. And it just says, again, the further the damage from the cell body, the more likely successful repair will be made. If the sprout has to travel too far, it could escape from the tunnel into surrounding tissue. An example of that might be a neuroma. So most people are familiar with neuromas being in the foot. They typically might be between the 4th and 5th or 3rd and 4th metatarsal. And so that's where somebody might step funny, or potentially they step on like a rock, a firm rock or something, and they may not have had very good shoes on, or they just put too much pressure on it and one day they have a lot of pain. But physically they look at their foot, they don't see anything wrong with it. If they feel in between there, if they know what they're looking for, they might feel what feels like a little knot almost. And it's quite sensitive. If they push on it just right, may not even take very much pressure if it's really mad at you. And there's not much people can do because, one, if you go in there and you cut it out, what do you think happens? You get scar tissue. It could grow back because, again, if you cut through that area and the nerve's trying to regrow, what do you think is going to happen? It might leak out again and rebundle itself up and not be where it's supposed to. So cutting out neuromas is not typically successful, but it can be for some. Oftentimes, wearing good shoes, protecting that area, and not putting direct pressure on it usually allows it to calm down. But sometimes they might have to do, the injection to calm down swelling and inflammation. What's that called? Cortisone or something like that? Yes. I cannot talk today. I swear. Yes, thank you. All right, so... and again, when we were talking about this particular picture, is this CNS or PNS when we're talking about these nerves going to an effector such as a muscle? PNS, right? Peripheral nervous system. Because we can repair those. But guess what? Number 4 said CNS axons do not repair. So oligodendrocytes do not form regrowth tunnels, right? They actually release growth inhibiting factors versus in the PNS, the Schwann cells were releasing growth factors to help the nerve root grow. Okay, so CNS inhibits it from happening, and it's oligodendrocytes, and they don't do this kind of repair. So you hurt one of those axons, who's going to replace it? Astrocytes, yes. Very cool. So let's see, what else do we want to do? I think that covered that pretty good. So that's why also you can't have neural brain tumors, right? We talked about that before, I think, exam 4 material, about whether you could have, where would a tumor occur, what kind of cell type, that type of thing. That was back on exam 4. So let's see. Now we get to move on to cranial nerves. My hope is that we finish this chapter today. Then I think on Thursday we finish ANS, and we're done. That's it. Then you have a week to study for exam 5 and a week to study for exam 6. What? Yes. All right, let's do this thing. Cranial nerves. This is a good review for you guys because you guys already had to learn this for your brain eval, right? Yes. I don't know. Maybe I'll come on Tuesday, and if you guys have questions or review or something, maybe. I'll be here anyway, one way or another, so. Cool, right? Yes. All right. So cranial nerves, you have 12 pair. 24 total nerves then, right? 12 on one side, 12 on the other. They're paired up. All except the vagus nerve serve the head and the neck only, okay? So serve kind of just means whether it's motor or sensory type output to these areas, or input if it's sensory coming in, right? Motor output, sensory input. So, so the vagus nerve is the only one out of those 12 cranial nerves that doesn't just do head and neck. All the other ones are head and neck only, okay? So most are mixed, but some would be a sensory only type 1. And our cranial nerves, CNS or PNS? Sounds like you're saying penis. I'm kidding. PNS. It is PNS because only CNS is just brain and spinal cord. Nerves that exit are all PNS. So cranial nerves, there's your keyword is nerve, is PNS. Okay? I'm just laughing because we just had the urogenital eval, which is urinary and genital system of reproductive system in 228, and so we said that word many, many times that day because it was part of their evals. So, all right, so anytime you see nerves, think PNS. PNS are nerves, and the other keyword was ganglia. CNS is brain and spinal cord. So cranial nerves leave the brain and are covered by CT wrappers. We have 12 pairs. All of them serve head and neck, sensory info and or motor. Sensory would be afferent. Motor would be efferent. Keep using those words because it gets easier and easier. Okay. So some of these are sensory only. So let's put some are sensory only. Some are motor only. And some are both. Some are both. So you can kind of think about that as you're looking at the various cranial nerves. If we're looking at our picture here, we have the olfactory bulb first. So that would be cranial nerve number 1. And it is much smaller in the human than it was on the sheep that you guys were looking at. It makes sense because a lot of animals have a much better sense of smell. And so that's why they will have larger olfactory bulbs. So that's cranial nerve number 1. Then you have what's called the olfactory tract. Okay. Then you have, what's a tract made out of? Maybe axons or something? Maybe? Let's go with that. Yes. Okay. What's an axon? Oh my gosh. All right, then we have cranial nerve number 2. Where does cranial number 2 going? Optic nerve. So it's going to your eyeballs, right? And it crosses over, and that's where the word chiasm comes from. So in the center here, this is the optic chiasm. So you have the optic nerve, and then optic chiasm, and then an optic tract, right? Then you guys had your oculomotor nerve. Now, olfactory, do you think that has any motor to it? Nope, sensory only, right? What about optic? Optic is sensory only. Oculomotor, however, motor, has the ones, it's part of what helps control the muscles, some of the muscles of the eye. So that's a motor nerve, oculomotor. Okay, optic nerve, sensory, oculomotor would be motor. Let's see, how about after oculomotor, then you go out to the side, you have your trochlear nerve, number 4. And you guys, just like for the brain eval, you can't just know the Roman numerals, you can't just know the names, you need to know both. Okay, then, so for trochlear, we'll talk about what they do in just a second. Then we have trigeminal, which is 5, and so that's this big guy right here. He has a couple different branches. So Roman numeral 5 is trigeminal. Then we come back more medial, and we have abducens right here. Then we have facial, which he actually also has a few different branches. So all of these are facial, Roman numeral 7. And then we have the glossopharyngeal or glossopharyngeal, which is 9. Then we have vagus, not spelled the same as Las Vegas, by the way. You have the vagus nerve. I'm coming back to it. Did I skip 8? Oh, I think I did. I came in a little bit too far. Sorry, let me fix that. Boop, boop. All right. Sorry about that. All right, so we had facial was just these parts right there. Sorry. 7. And then vestibulocochlear, there we go, is 8. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so he's right here, this guy. Then we have glossopharyngeal, which is 9. Right there. And then vagus, right here, which again is the only one that doesn't just work for head and neck. Then we have what's called accessory nerve, and you'll see in a lot of other terminology, spinal accessory, and that's how I learned it in chiropractic school, was spinal accessory. So accessory is 11, and that includes these guys coming off the spinal cord here. All of these guys are part of spinal accessory, okay? And then you have hypoglossal. So glossal for glossopharyngeal and hypoglossal. Glossal is referring to the tongue, okay? And so that's these guys that kind of look like little hairs at that point, and that's 12 right there, okay? So if you guys look down, olfactory has to do with smell. Optic has to do with your vision. We said those are both sensory only, correct? And then ocular motor, we said, has to do with the skeletal muscles of the eye, but it's only some of them. So these are the rectus eye muscles. Rectus, MM for muscle. And so that is the muscles that allow you to look up, down, medial, lateral, okay? So those, rectus means parallel or straight. So those are think straightforward type of muscle movements, up, down, medial, lateral, medial, lateral. Can you look lateral at the same time? Can you look medial at the same time? You can look medial at the same time, that gives you the cross-eyed look, right? Can you go lateral at the same time? Not unless you have something wrong. Okay? You cannot both look lateral. And actually what happens is when you look lateral with one eye, the other side gets inhibited and naturally moves medial and goes with it over to the same side. Okay? So you cannot both activate the two lateral muscles at the same time. And then if we look at trochlear, those are what have to do, that is motor, and it has to do with the oblique eye muscles. So oblique eye muscles. And so what you guys probably weren't able to see or realize on the sheep brain is a trochlear almost kind of looks like a pulley system. So the weird thing is the muscle kind of goes around a band of tissue, and this is what helps pull the eye when you do contract that muscle in order to look obliquely. Okay? So trochlear is actually named well. You guys just don't realize that it's being named because it goes through a trochlea in order to pull the muscle. So it makes sense once you realize that, but until you do, you're like, okay, trochlear, I have no idea why it's called that. Trigeminal is the largest one of the cranial nerves, the big hunk there. And it's mostly sensory to the face, although there is a little bit of motor with the muscles of mastication or chewing muscles. Okay. And then there are three branches of trigeminal. So I'm going to move this up a little bit. So with trigeminal, that is mostly sensory. To face, but it does have motor to chewing muscles, mastication, yep. And it has the three branches. So if you were to like hold up like three fingers on your hand, so your pinky and your thumb are touching each other, and you put that across your face, so right hand on the right side of your face, the branch that says ophthalmic would be the one that goes superior up above your eye. The one that says maxillary would go across the maxillary bone, right? Maxillary nerve. So it's running across your cheekbone, if you will. And then mandibular makes sense because it's going along the mandible. And this would innervate half the face. So the right trigeminal does the right side of the face. Left trigeminal would do the left side of the face. Okay. So also, if somebody were to get shingles, for example, did you guys know the most common place to get shingles is the ophthalmic branch on the trigeminal nerve? However, in all the years that I was in practice, the most common place I happened to see on my patients was on the torso. So I did have one patient that had it on her neck. Shingles is the chickenpox virus, herpes simplex virus, that comes back and decides to bother you again. It used to be just like most people were affected 50 and older, but I've had patients that were in their teens and 20s. My husband got it when he was 35. It could be due to stressful events. And basically it's where, remember we talked about like the dorsal root ganglia? So it basically, the chickenpox virus that was out superficial bothering your skin hid in that dorsal root area and laid dormant and didn't bother you again until you had a very stressful event. Could be a death in the family, whatever. And oftentimes if somebody's had it once, they could have it again the next time they get a cold, sunburn, you know, some sort of injury, anything that could stress them out, stressful job, whatever, test anxiety from us, you know. So, but like I said, ophthalmic is typically the most common one, but I never had a patient that had that, and it still is probably the most common one, but it was just kind of funny that I didn't get to see that very often on that area. As far as abducens, these are for the eye abductor muscles. So ABD, abduction, abducens. So these are eye abductor muscles. Abductor eye muscles. This is what actually lets you look lateral. So I screwed up when I told you guys the other one on the rectus muscle. They probably both get activated. I'll double check that for you guys before the next class. I don't want to screw you guys up. All right, so this one is just for, we'll say, eye lateral. All right, and this is the one that I should have waited and said, when one gets activated, the other abducens is inhibited. So because you can't look both lateral at the same time, otherwise you're like a chameleon or a bird that has the eyes on the side. That'd be kind of crazy, right? So I will double check on ocular motor about that lateral part that I told you before. All right, so facial is motor to the facial muscles, although it does have some sensory for taste. So technically it's a mixed nerve, but it's mostly motor to facial muscles. I'll put some taste in parentheses because that one is technically mixed. And then vestibulocochlear, okay, that has to do with your equilibrium and hearing. So equilibrium is your balance, right? And we actually go through balance and hearing a lot in the very beginning of 228 when we start talking about special senses. We do the eyeball, we do the hearing and stuff. And then we also have glossopharyngeal, glossal for tongue. Pharyngeal is talking about the pharynx up high here. So tongue and pharynx. So think back of the throat for pharynx. And this is mostly sensory for taste. So glossopharyngeal will have some motor for the tongue and the pharynx, but it'll also be mostly sensory for taste. Vagus, the only cranial nerve we said that extends beyond the head, and it actually goes to almost all of your internal organs, okay? And it is mostly motor. And it is parasympathetic output. So I'll put P/S for parasympathetic output. And also autonomic or ANS control. So what do you guys know about the parasympathetic system versus sympathetic on how our body works? What's fight or flight versus rest digest? So parasympathetic is no. Rest digest. Okay, and are we mostly in rest digest or are we mostly in fight or flight? Mostly parasympathetic rest digest. Okay, and so because of that, you can see that the vagus nerve would give a lot of output. This will be quite important for us, right? And then autonomic nervous system. Autonomic means like automatic, the things you don't have to think about to control, like your breathing, your heart rate, things like that. It doesn't mean that you can't have sympathetic override, like I need my heartbeat to go faster so I can get away from the bear. That's more important than digesting my meal and being at a normal keel, normal level, right? So sympathetic can override it, but parasympathetic is what we are typically in, and autonomic nervous control. So vagus is both, even though it said mostly motor, vagus is both sensory and motor. Accessory, spinal accessory is motor to the neck and upper shoulder muscles. SH for shoulder, MM for muscles. Motor to neck and upper shoulder muscles. And then hypoglossal, hypo meaning below, glossal tongue. So this has to do with speech and swallowing muscles. So that would be motor or sensory? Motor. So speech and swallowing muscles. All right, so those were your cranial nerves. Now we get to talk about our spinal nerves. So spinal nerves, we have 31 pairs or 62 total spinal nerves. It seems a little weird, and I'll explain it in a second. 8 cervical, but we only have how many cervical bones? 7. 12 thoracic made sense, 5 lumbar made sense, 5 sacral made sense if you counted the holes, and 1 coccygeal. Now, the reason you have 8 for the cervical is because you have 1 more cervical nerve compared to the 7 cervical vertebra. The first nerve comes out above C1. So if the first one comes out just under the occiput above C1, And then you have C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7 would be coming out above C7, the vertebra, right? So then C8 is coming out between C7 and T1. And then you have T1 comes out after T1, T2 after T2, so on and so forth, okay? So that's why you have 8 cervical nerves, and then the rest of them make more sense, 12, 5, 5, and then 1. Okay, and all spinal nerves are mixed nerves. So all spinal nerves are mixed. What do I mean by mixed? Sensory and motor. And I just put a big N with a period meaning nerves for me, okay? So, but remember, not all cranial nerves were mixed. Some were sensory only, some were motor only, but spinal nerves are mixed, always mixed, okay? Now, we have a picture here, and I'm going to draw, remember when I drew that more complicated picture and I screwed you guys up on that first lecture, and I was like, shoot, I messed you guys up, and I kept saying the wrong word and screwing you guys up. So I drew the more simplified picture on the last lecture, and now I'm going to draw the same one as the first time with the extra part to it in just a second. But first you can kind of see it on here. So which side on this picture is posterior and which side is anterior on this picture? If you're not sure, look at the vertebra. The spinous process points to the back. So this is the posterior side. The body of the vertebra, remember here's the body, is on the anterior side, okay? All right, now, some of the things that we have that help out, we have, you have a little bit of adipose or fat to help cushion our spinal cord. Do you guys remember the name of one of the ligaments that helps keep the spinal cord in place? No? There's that one. Yeah, tell me that one. Filum terminale is at the very bottom. That one is the one that anchors you longitudinally. So we have filum terminale, and then there's one I'm trying to give you guys a hint. I'm smiling at everybody and clicking my teeth together. Starts with a D. Dentate ligament. And remember that one was the horizontal one holding things in. So you guys remember do they show it on this picture here? I don't think they're showing it on here. But remember we had the dentate ligament that kind of helped keep things anchored into the intervertebral, the vertebral canal, spinal canal. Thank you. Okay. All right. Gosh, we're going to have the same problems today with my pictures. All right. So you guys see the spinous process going back. You guys saw that we have I'm going to draw it to the side, the same picture I had drawn before. So here's our generic spinal cord, right? And let's put our H in here, kind of like a butterfly. Okay, and then we had our little hole in the center, which is our spinal canal, right? Okay, CSF is flowing through that. We had on the posterior or dorsal side, oh, let me draw that better. I need a bump in it. All right, so then we have, and I'm going to draw that little thing going to the back there for a second and then continue it on. And then under here, I'm really sorry, this is not matching up when I'm trying to draw. It's offset from the thing, so I apologize. And this comes off like that. And I'm going to draw this angle down there so that it makes a little more sense. So another name for posterior and anterior. Another name for posterior, we could call it dorsal, and another name for anterior, we could call it ventral. Okay, so we have things that we had described before. That is really bugging me how this looks here. Sorry. Circle. All right, that'll work. Okay. What is the bump called? Dorsal root ganglion. So this bump here is our DRG. And who sits in the DRG? I feel like I'm saying military terms. Like the cell body, right? And it's multipolar, unipolar, bipolar, unipolar. Unipolar also tells you what? Sensory only. Okay? So here's our cell body. Here is our axon coming to the unipolar cell body. And he's going to come and we'll show that he's going to synapse over there. Okay. Now, there is, what else do I want to tell you so I don't get off topic here? All right. We did the spinal cord. Spinal cord is the dural sheath, fat, denticulate. Did I say dentate? Denticulate ligament. Filum terminale, that helps hold it in place. Okay, so we have the DRG. This area is the dorsal root. Okay, the DRG is on part of the dorsal root. So it's on the dorsal side. It's the root coming off of the spinal cord. So if that's the dorsal root, what do you think the ventral one is called? Ventral root. Okay, so there's the ventral root. Now, this little guy I have going off to the back is the dorsal ramus. Ramus means arm. So this is the dorsal ramus. They're showing you, so here's the DRG here. Here's that dorsal ramus going back here and branching off out to that muscle. On the other side, same thing. You have your DRG there. Here's that dorsal ramus going off to these other branches. What do you think the dorsal root is going to? What do you have on your back? That's anything important? Anything important back there? I mean, it's all kind of important, but it's muscles and skin. Not anything super important on your backside, right? Right? What about on the ventral side of your body? Organs. Yes, you still have muscles. Yes, you still have cutaneous to the skin, that kind of thing. But this is why the dorsal ramus is kind of a skinny little tiny thing. There's not a lot of axon, not a lot of girth that has to go through this area to those posterior muscles, okay, or skin, versus the ventral root has lots of information coming to and from it, and then this part here is going to be mixed, okay, and when it exits, that's your spinal nerve. Okay, so you have the roots are closest to the spinal cord itself. Those have not exited the, if you guys look at the picture here, here's the dorsal root, here's that ventral root here. It becomes mixed here for sure, okay? And so that's just after it's left the spinal column, the bony part. Okay, now, notice like I did the more simplified picture last time, we added the dorsal ramus back on this one. This part right here, we're going to talk about, not right now, but we're going to add to it again one more time, but I'll talk about that when we get to that guy there, the sympathetic trunk ganglion and the rami communicantes. So, all right, so here's our picture. Let's talk a little bit about some of the distribution of spinal nerves real quick, but I wanted to point that out. What else do I want to tell you? Anything else yet? Let's see. Did my dorsal root. Dorsal rami is smaller because there's not as much stuff dorsally. It can still have afferent and efferent, though, because, again, if we're talking to muscles, that means it has to have efferent. That's an effector. So we have both motor and sensory that can exit the dorsal ramus, okay, or enter if it's sensory. Sensory would be like the cutaneous skin part, what you feel when somebody touches you on your back. Ventral rami would be here. Ventral rami. That is mixed. It's larger also due to more axons. So technically, this would be, if I wanted to change the color of my neurons so you guys can see. If let's say I do blue for my sensory, so this will be a sensory receptor comes in, goes to my dorsal root ganglion, unipolar. He goes and he talks over here. He goes to the dorsal horn, right? And he's going to talk to, depending on what we're going to show in a little bit, but we'll put an interneuron there. And then we can do red for an effector. And he's going to come out. And we're going to put E for effector. Okay, so simple basic picture. Just wanted to put that in there real quick. All right, so if we were talking about a basic reflex in a minute, we're going to come back to this picture. So distribution of spinal nerves. Each spinal nerve arises from the junction of a dorsal and a ventral root. The dorsal root is sensory only, meaning it's afferent. The ventral root is motor only, meaning it is efferent. Okay. What else do we want to say here? On the ventral root, immediately after exiting the intervertebral foramina, the hole out between the two spinal bones, the spinal nerve will split into dorsal and ventral rami. The ventral or anterior rami serves most of the body, and the dorsal posterior rami serves muscles of the skin and back. So maybe I should have drawn my dorsal rami a little bit more out potentially. So we'll put the bone, let's say the foramina is like right there. How's that? Will that help you guys a little bit? Where the hole is, where it's exiting? So that you guys realize dorsal rami is outside of the bone and the ventral rami is outside of the bone, outside of the vertebral column. All right. And so it says ventral rami goes to most of the body. Dorsal is going to muscles and skin of the back. Now let's talk about plexuses. Okay, so plexi or plexuses are branching networks formed by the junction of adjacent or next to ventral rami. So ventral, again, had to do with the bulk of the body, right? So these aren't our dorsal rami. These are the ventral rami. That's key here. And what they do is they exit from the spinal cord. They diverge. See how they are they are coming together here, right? And then look, it diverges again. So they come together, they split apart. That's what a plexus is. And you can see that in this picture they're showing you C5, 6, 7, 8, and T1 are coming together. They diverge and converge again a couple different times. So you have this guy, he came together there, he split apart, he came together there, he split apart, and then he may split apart again there. This guy came together. He also has some that come off the back side and go somewhere else. He came apart there and met up with this guy over here and this guy and this guy, and then they came down and then they split again over here, so on and so forth. That's a plexus, okay? So there are 4 plexi that you guys need to know. The cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus, okay? So cervical serves mostly the head and neck. The big one there that we're talking about is the phrenic nerve is part of this plexus. The phrenic nerve is important because it has to do with the diaphragm. So that's why we say serves or innervates the diaphragm. Diaphragm. All right. So when you have hiccups, for example, it's because your phrenic nerve is sending signals and causing your diaphragm to spasm. And sometimes it goes away and sometimes it takes a while for it to go away. The brachial plexus serves the upper limb. And so there are 3 main nerves I want you guys to know. There are others, but these are the 3 I want you guys to learn, which is median, ulnar, and radial nerves. The median nerve has to do with the flexor muscles of the forearm and hand. So flexor muscles of forearm and hand. The ulnar nerve has to do with flexor muscles of the ulnar side of the forearm and hand. So flexor muscles of the ulnar side of forearm and hand. And then the ulnar nerve also, if you guys feel on the posterior lateral side of your elbow area, right? Or medial side, I guess I should say. When you've smacked your elbow against something by accident, does it feel good? Does it make you laugh? It's called the funny bone, but it's not really funny and it hurts like heck. That's what they're kind of talking about. It's not because it's a bone. It's because you smacked that nerve. So a funny bone is more like a figure of speech when they say that, right? And it's because there's really no protection there, right? You don't have like fat and muscle stuff like on your buttock to protect that area, like your sciatic nerve. So this is pretty superficial. It's easy to bang against it and hurt, essentially, right? So it's the medial epicondyle. You'll get tingling, and where you'll notice it on that would be the pinky and the part of your ring finger. Okay, so if you're in anatomical position, it's the medial side of the ring finger. So let's see what else. Then radial would be the extensor muscles of the forearm and hand. So radial is extensor muscles of forearm and hand. Okay, so these do all have sensory and motor, but we're going to focus on the motor aspect right now, okay, for when we're talking about these nerves for the most part. That's why we're just talking about extensors and flexors. We're talking about the motor side of it. Lumbar plexus serves the lower limb, and so, for example, femoral versus, if we talk about this, okay, if we're going to talk about lumbar plexus versus the sacral plexus, which one do you think is more anterior on the body, and which one do you think is more posterior on the body? So easy one is, think sacral is where? On your butt side, right? Back side of your body. So that would be the posterior part of your thigh versus lumbar will be anterior. And if you look at femoral versus sciatic, that makes more sense. Femoral, you're thinking like in the groin or inguinal region, right? So that would be more anterior versus sacral or sciatic nerve, you're thinking the back side of your thigh. So I'm going to put femoral, we're going to put anterior, sciatic, we're going to say posterior. For femoral, you're talking about the flexors of the hip, and it also, so it flexes the hip and it extends the knee, right? Especially now that you guys had to learn actions. So this should be easy for you guys. If we're talking about sciatic or sacral plexus, we're talking about being able to flex the knee and extend the hip. If you're not sure, think about if you wanted to move the posterior thigh muscle and you contracted your hamstrings, what direction would your leg end up moving? That's exactly what I've written there. Okay? If I wanted to contract my thigh muscles, like the quadricep and stuff, what is my leg doing? I would be approximating my leg up, and my lower leg would be coming up, which is extension of the knee, right? Flexion would be kicking it back, but it's hip flexion, knee extension. Okay? So if you think about, if I stimulated the nerve to the muscles of that part of my thigh, what is my leg going to do? That's what I've written there. So lumbar and sacral both do the lower limb, but one is more anterior and one is more posterior. The other thing to think about with these plexi is if somebody had a transection, what's a transection again? A cut. And in this case, we could say if they had a transection or if they had an injury to a spinal cord level, okay, would depend on what part of the body might be affected by it. Okay, so for example, if you did, say, the upper part of the cervical levels, okay, like C1, C2 area, do you think it will affect your breathing or not? Yeah. Why is it going to affect your breathing? Diaphragm, thank you. It affects your diaphragm right there. Cervical plexus, phrenic nerve. Okay, if you're high enough up, it would have affected that, correct? If you damaged really high up on your spinal cord, above where the phrenic nerve comes out. However, if you get damaged below where the phrenic nerve would have exited, So you guys don't know this, but the little mnemonic or saying is 3, 4, 5 keeps you alive. That's the phrenic nerve. Okay, 3, 4, 5. So if you had damage below C5, for example, a lower cervical damage, let's say C7 got damaged, right? You have not affected the phrenic nerve, so you could still breathe on your own. It doesn't mean you're not a paraplegic or a quadriplegic, correct? But it means you could breathe. Okay, so think Christopher Reeves. He broke C1, C2 smushed up against his spinal cord from being thrown over the horse, right? He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe on his own. Phrenic nerve. Okay, so you can think about at a certain level if something got damaged, what might be affected by it. Okay. All right, so this picture here is a little more complicated than what we need, so we are going to simplify it a tad bit. Okay. All right, so what do we want to simplify it with? All right, so we're going to start towards the top part. So this is your cerebrum. You guys already saw in previous picture, previous lecture, midbrain, medulla oblongata, and then we ended up having to our skeletal muscle at the bottom and our spinal cord. So exiting the spinal cord to go to your effector, okay? If we look at, they drew 2 nerves here, and we're going to focus on the one that is more medial because it does something that we have talked about and we want to reiterate right now, and that is decussate. Do you guys remember what decussate means? To cross over. So here is that nerve, and I'm going to follow his axon down. So he started in the primary motor cortex of the precentral gyrus. He's traveling down. He goes through the diencephalon. He's going through his cerebral peduncles. Okay, he's still on the same side there. But now when he gets to the medulla oblongata, he's going to decussate or cross over. So he went from the, I don't know if I guess he's facing us. So it would be his left side of the brain. But me looking at the picture, it's the right side of the picture, crosses over to the left side of the picture, okay? So it crossed over at the medulla oblongata. It continues down to our dorsal horn. But in this case, he goes all the way towards the lateral or ventral horn. I just want you guys to see that it's coming down to that area. And they do have an interneuron there, but we are not going to talk about the interneuron. You're going to pretend like it doesn't exist. We're simplifying the picture. So this neuron is just going to come down, and he's going to synapse with this other neuron. I'll draw him in red. Let's do that. So this guy comes down, and he synapses here. In this case, the ventral horn. And then he's going to synapse with our new neuron there, not an interneuron, and that's going to go out to our effector. So is that a motor neuron or a sensory neuron? It's motor because it's going output to the muscle, okay? So is this motor neuron unipolar, multipolar, bipolar? Multipolar. 99% of your neurons are multipolar. So if all else fails and you're not sure and it's not sensory, it's got to be multipolar. Just go with it, right? Yes. So most common neuron is multipolar. The axon travels from the cerebral cortex through the cerebral peduncles through the medulla oblongata. It crosses over, called decussating, in the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. For motor, we just want to know that decussation occurs in the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. We're not trying to make this a complicated thing. So if you're reading through the text and you're seeing additional information, just go by the simple part here. Then it synapses in the ventral horn. So earlier I drew it in the dorsal horn. This picture, we skipped an interneuron. We went right to the ventral horn. Okay, and then remember, motor neurons exit the ventral root, which is where I drew the red. It went through the ventral root. Okay, so if it had been sensory, it would have been coming in from the dorsal root, but this is motor, so we're going out the ventral root, and it will exit and innervate the skeletal muscle. So this was a picture of just 2 motor neurons. Keep it simple, okay? Now we're going to look at the levels of the motor control, and there are 3 levels. We have segmental, which talks about the spinal cord level. It has projection level, which is talking about the cerebral hemispheres or motor cortex. and we have something called pre-command. So these are levels of motor control. So segmental level, the lowest level, spinal cord, right? That's our key word there. Oh, I'm in red now. Let's go back to black. So spinal cord control, automatic movements. So it makes sense that we have something called reflexes there, right? Do you control your reflexes, or do they just happen without you thinking about it? It just happens, right? So reflexes, we're going to talk about it in detail in just a moment. The reflexes are protective of you, keep you alive and healthy and safe, right? So you don't get hurt. And we have spinal cord circuits also at the segmental level. So these are both at segmental level, which is spinal cord level. All right, so spinal cord circuits are network circuits of the ventral horn neurons. Ventral horn neurons, okay? So this is already here before you're born. You are hardwired with this, okay? It already exists. Your body just has to develop so it can either hold your own body weight or let your muscles develop or something like that. But this is already there. You're born with this. You don't have to create it. You just have to learn how to turn it on and off and be able to do it. You have to get your body, you can't, it doesn't work just laying there. You got to be able to move on some of these. So central pattern generators, or CPGs, okay, are circuit controlling autonomic or rhythmical movements, okay? Do you guys remember we talked about some neural patterns that were reverberating or automatic, rhythmical, like your sleep cycle, walking in this case, those kinds of things? This is kind of talking about that same thing, but this is, how does this occur now? Now we're learning about how did that work. So central means CNS, pattern is talking about a specific circuit, and then generator, CPG. So we just have to know how to turn it on and off. And the most common one to learn about is a walking CPG. So this is a reverberating circuit. So once you start it, it begins the loop and allows you to keep walking from there, okay? So this is part of a segment of your spinal cord. It's hardwired in. So let's put part of your spinal cord circuitry. Okay, you're born with it. So let's put from birth on spinal cord circuits, from birth. Okay, so before you even know how to walk, it's already there. And one way that you could see this in action if you want is if you have a baby that can't quite walk yet. So they typically learn somewhere, give or take, around age 1. So if you have a young baby, even a baby that's only, say, a month old, okay, take your little baby and hold it over a tabletop, hang on to it. Don't do the Michael Jackson thing. Like, you're not hanging them over the railing or anything, but put them over a surface. That surface could be your lap. That surface could be a desktop, that kind of thing. So hold your kid on the torso, hold it over this, and you're hanging on to them, and let their foot touch the surface. What happens? They start trying to walk. They lift their legs up like this. They look like a weird marionette puppet when they do it because they don't know what they're doing, and they can't do it on their own yet because they haven't developed the muscles to hold their own body up and figure out balance and stuff. But they already know how to walk. They don't know it. Their body knows it. It's a spinal cord segment. It's already there. You're hardwired with it. That's how you can see it works when the kid doesn't even know how to walk. Okay, so that's an example, was a walking CPG, central pattern generators, all right? Let's see, for projection level, so this is another motor control level, okay? So this is the next level higher. So this, let me see if I can add some space here to write in. Where's my, there, oh, I hate it when it does that. All right. All right, so spinal cord projection levels. So this controls the on-off of the spinal cord segment, the circuitry. So projection level is what controls the on-off of the spinal cord segments or circuitry. Okay, this is another name for it would be the command neurons. All right, so they tell the segment to turn on or off. So this controls the CPGs. Okay. This consists of what we call upper motor neurons. Okay. And they will project down to the segmental level. Okay. So here's that word, projection level, project down to the segmental level. All right, and then the neuron that exits out from the ventral horn, that would be the lower motor neuron. Okay, so the neuron from our picture that exits the ventral horn was the lower motor neuron. So that makes sense, right? The upper one that's telling you what to do is the upper motor neuron. The lower one that exits out is the lower motor neuron. Okay. Now the third component or factor is called the pre-command level. So this allows us to precisely start or stop the motor activity. Okay, so this is all about coordination. So coordinates movements or muscle activity. Okay, and so you have to know proprioception. What was proprioception? Proprioception was your knowing where your body position was, right? You could have your eyes closed, but you know where your foot is. Your eyes could be closed. You could touch your finger to your nose. You know the difference between where your nose is and where your eyebrow is or your lip, okay? So you have to know proprioception info in order to coordinate and do this. And who did we say does a lot of that fine-tuning of muscle control? The cerebellum, right? So we have here for pre-command levels, cerebellum and basal nuclei. So the cerebellum we have is the main integration center for precise motor control. And then we also have basal nuclei. Do you guys remember what the basal nuclei's job was? It was an inhibitor of unwanted movements, right? So it prevented you from doing things. Cerebellum is telling you how to do it and do it better and more precise. Okay, it's modulating. Oh, it would be better if we move that just a millimeter to the right, and then I think it'll be even better. Okay, or let's contract that a little bit harder, and I think we'll get the right amount that we need the next time we're going to do the same action. And the basal nuclei are going, nope, don't do that. Nope, don't do that. Nope, don't lift your finger up. Nope, don't do crazy arm movements. Don't look like a spaz. Quit it. Quit it. Don't do it. That's the difference here. They both have to work in order for you to have a better control of what you are wanting to accomplish with your movement there. So the basal nuclei are a more complex part of motor control. Output is inhibitory, like we said, to prevent unwanted movement. So we kind of briefly talked about Parkinson's before. So you have the substantia nigra, which produces dopamine. And then if you have a problem with that, and now you're not producing dopamine, now that can't talk to the basal nuclei. So that's where somebody with Parkinson's can be affected. It's kind of like a series of steps. So you can see it gets complicated and stuff, and why somebody then might have like an intention tremor. we would all have a tremor right now if we didn't have our basal nuclei saying, don't do that. Don't have excess other additional movements that you don't need. So your basal nuclei is working so that that is not happening, okay? Let's see, and Huntington's chorea, we talked about that briefly, right? Chorea means dance. So Huntington's chorea, there's a genetic disease process going on there. And they basically, I think of it as like Elaine from Seinfeld dancing, you know, when she's doing her crazy dance, right? So these people also are moving when because their basal nuclei is not inhibiting those movements. And chorea means dance. So it kind of looks, just think like Elaine, okay? All right, super fast. Let's see if we can do these reflex terminologies. So ipsi means the same. Contra means opposite. The nice thing about this is this to me makes a lot of sense if you just think about the terminology. So ipsi is talking about the input and output are on the same side. Contralateral is saying that the input and output are on opposite sides. Okay. So in a second, you're going to see what a cross-extensor reflex is that has to do with contralateral. Okay, so if we look at spinal reflexes, it means the spinal cord is the integration center. The somatic reflex activates, you know, somatic had to do with your skeletal muscle, right? Versus autonomic had to do with smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and your glands. Okay. So when we say that the spinal cord is the integration center, it means that we have that interneuron part that we took out of that one picture a second ago. So if we have an interneuron, this makes a connection to a simple or complex pattern. Now a reflex is a simple response. Think caveman, quick, easy, you don't think about it. Okay, so reflex, simple. There are 5 components of a somatic reflex arc, and there are 6 if we're talking about the autonomic reflex arc, okay? So there are 5 for, put somatic here. Somatic is 5, autonomic is 6 components, okay? I'll put component. Okay. So when we're talking about certain things, so the 5 parts, you have a receptor. So this is what tells the stimulus, gives you an electrical impulse. This could be your skin, right? It's telling you something touched you. It's telling you something's hot, whatever, right? So that's your sensory part of it. Then you have the sensory neuron that conducts that impulse to the CNS. So that's our blue neuron here. He comes over here in the DRG. He has his unipolar cell body is there. And then he comes over into the dorsal horn. And then he synapses with an interneuron, which here they did as the purple guy. And then from there, so this is our integration center, right? So we're integrating, we're in the CNS because it's spinal cord, so that makes sense. And then we have the motor neuron. So this is the sort of light reddish color. We have in the ventral horn the cell body, and then he goes out the ventral ramus, and he goes to the effector. In this case is the skeletal muscle. Okay, so that's your motor neuron, conducts the impulse from the CNS to the muscle or the gland. We're going to put gland in parentheses because gland would mean that we're talking about autonomic. And if we want to keep this as the 5 components of somatic, then we have to be talking about skeletal muscle, SK for skeletal muscle, correct? So the effector is just going to be, if it's somatic, skeletal muscle. Gland in parentheses means that that has to do with the autonomic again, okay? All right. So what else do I want to tell you? In the integration center, that was where the interneuron is. So integration, that's your interneuron is C there, interneuron. All right. And then for a stretch reflex, let's see if I can say this super fast for you guys. Can we do that? If I can get my paper. All right, so super fast, and then I'll add it in really quick. All right, so stretch reflex says that it uses the muscle spindles. Where are muscle spindles? In the muscle itself, right? Proprioceptor is an interoceptor. It's in the muscle organ itself. So an example of the stretch reflex might be the knee jerk, okay? So there's a contraction of the agonist and then an inhibition of the antagonist, and that's called reciprocal inhibition. So I'll add this into the notes in just a moment. So if I bonk you on the knee, and even though I bonk you on the tendon, let's say the patellar tendon, but it puts a quick stretch on my quadricep muscle, okay? That's the stretch that I'm talking about. So even if I mash it here, it tugs on my muscle. That tug, okay, is what causes this stretch reflex arc. I tugged it, I stretched it. Does that make sense? If I smack you on the left knee, should my right knee jerk? It should not. Because that would mean contralateral. This is ipsilateral. It makes sense if I smack me on the left, that it's the left leg that's going to jerk. The reflex all stays on the same side. That's what this picture is showing you right there. It's all staying on the same side. It didn't cross over. No decussation occurs. It's a quick arc. It didn't even talk to your brain. It just had the integration in the spinal cord and it went right out. It reacted, okay? That's the stretch reflex. The flexor reflex is the same way as saying the withdraw reflex, okay? So you could think of this, as said there, usually it's a painful stimulus. So let's say you have a hot pot on the stove, you didn't know it had been on, somebody just turned it off, so you didn't know it's a hot pot. You go and touch it with your right hand, you touch the pot, and what's going to happen? Your flexor muscles engage and contract. It pulls your arm away, so that's why it says it's a flexor reflex. It's a withdraw reflex. You're getting away from it. Is it ipsi or contralateral? Ipsi. So it's not I grabbed it with my right and my left hand goes flying away. No, it's the same side, ipsilateral. So right hand grabs it, right hand withdraws, okay? So that's the flexor reflex. Tendon reflex usually uses Golgi tendon organs. So this has to do with your proprioception. It's interoceptors. You could think of this like Achilles and bicep tendons when they potentially have and can rupture, okay? So this is protective. It's to prevent your tendons from stretching excessively, thus you don't want it to rupture or tear. So it's opposite effect as the stretch reflex, okay? So because of the stretch that put on it, it pulled in. This one's saying don't stretch me too far. So it inhibits the agonist, meaning the one that has the Golgi tendon organ in it, and it contracts the antagonist. It is a reciprocal activation, and this is also same side, ipsilateral, because it makes sense. If you are about to overstretch your right bicep tendon, you don't need to inhibit and tell your left one not to do it. You have to tell the one that's happening to it, so it's ipsilateral. Crossed extensor reflex has to do with the flexor reflex also. Okay, so this last one, cross extensor reflex accompanies flexor reflex. So what it's talking about is this is of the lower extremity. This is complex spinal cord reflex. So this isn't the simple ones that we just talked about on the first three. This is complex. This one means that if you had a nail or broken glass on the ground and you step on it with your right foot, what are you going to do? You got to lift that foot up and get it off the whatever's making it hurt, correct? But in order for you to lift your right foot up, what else do you have to do? You got to be able to balance and put weight on your left side of the body, the left foot. Otherwise, if your left side didn't know this was going to happen and you lift up your right, what are you going to do? Fall over. So this is why it's complex. It crosses the body. It has to do with both sides. So it is the withdraw reflex is on the hurt foot. You have to shift weight to the opposite side in order to lift the hurt foot. This is protective, and you're activating muscles on the opposite side of the body to shift weight. So at the same time you're activating muscles to withdraw on the right, you had to activate muscles to allow your body to put weight on the left. And that is it for that. When we come back to class on Thursday, we'll do the autonomic nervous system, chapter 15, and we'll be done with chapter 5, unit 5. Woo! All right, guys, thank you. Okay. Maybe I can pause this. So I just wanted to add in the notes real quick to what I just spoke about on stretch reflex. So you guys do not need to worry about the monosynaptic reflex versus polysynaptic reflex. We're going to keep this kind of basic and easy. So under stretch reflex, an example would be the knee jerk. It is, like I said, the proprioceptor is the in the muscle spindles. It's an interoceptor. It's in the muscle organ itself. It would be a contraction of the agonist, and that's the one that has the spindle in it and was stretched. It would be inhibition of the antagonist, and this is called reciprocal inhibition. Okay, and again, this is all on the ipsilateral side. All right, and this side was the stretch example. For flexor reflex, oh, come on. This thing is giving me trouble today, guys. There we go. Yeah, get enough room to write here. All right, so back to flexor. That was your withdraw reflex. Think of like the, oh geez, hot pot example. So this is protective. It is where it overrides the spinal pathways to prevent other activity. It's ipsilateral flexor. So it's an ipsilateral flexor response to the painful stimulus. And that is this side of the picture there, where they're showing that something is going to burn you. They have like a little candle there, so you flex in and you pull your arm away, essentially. The other thing on this picture that we didn't have was this neuron here that had its cell body there in the dorsal root ganglion comes in, and we're going to give it an interneuron here and then have the motor go across there. Okay. With the flexor reflex, I mentioned also that it is related to crossed extensor reflex, but let me put in tendon reflex next. So tendon reflex has to do with the Golgi tendon organ, which is the proprioceptor. It's an interoceptor. This would be protective also. Protective. It prevents tendon from stretching excessively. All right, and it is opposite of the stretch reflex. So opposite of stretch reflex. It inhibits the agonist, or you could think of it as it keeps the agonist relaxed, and it is a contraction of the antagonist. It is also reciprocal activation. And it is also ipsilateral, which makes sense. Okay, so that was where I talked about preventing like your Achilles or your biceps tendon from rupturing. So we said the cross extensor reflex was related to the flexor reflex. So this is often accompanies flexor reflex, it said, of the lower extremity, of lower extremity. Okay, so I don't know where that writing came from on the bottom there. Okay, so this is a complex. So the other ones were not complex. This one is complex spinal reflex with ipsilateral. Oh my gosh, I cannot draw today. Oh, this is having problems. All right, here we go. It's thinking. I'm sorry the pen is having problems, guys. There we go. Okay, so complex spinal reflex with ipsilateral withdrawal come on. We're almost done here. Work with me here, people. Oh my gosh. The pen is dying, guys. I don't know what the heck happened. Oh my goodness. So I'll just write down below it. Okay, here we go. With ipsilateral withdrawal and contralateral extension and contralateral extension. So the example we gave here was stepping on the broken glass. And let's see, so this was also protective, obviously. And you're activating muscle on opposite side to shift weight. All right, that'll do it.